The turbine should not have been turning. I knew that before I checked the panel. I knew it from the feel of the tower first. The whole steel column carried a low vibration up through the soles of my boots, a steady pulse that didn't match the dead air around us. Out on the maintenance deck, the night had gone unnaturally still. No spray coming off the black water. No gulls. No wind pressing against my coveralls. Just that deep mechanical tremor, rising through the bolts and grating as if something much larger than the turbine had put its weight against it from somewhere I couldn't see. Then the smell hit me. Salt and ozone, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. I looked up. The blades were moving, but slowly, and the wrong way. Not freely spinning in a cross-current. Not drifting from residual momentum. They were turning with intent, cutting against the sea breeze with the patient rhythm of a lock being worked open. Above them, the fog hung low and thick, and it wasn't cold. That was the part that made my hands go numb. It was warm. Warm enough that I could feel it on my face like breath. Something moved inside it. Not through it. Inside it. A vast circular motion, too smooth to be a bird, too controlled to be storm debris. I couldn't see a body, not really. Just the fog shaping itself around something enormous as it banked over the platform. Then every emergency beacon on the wind farm lit up at once. Red light washed over the deck. Sirens kicked in a heartbeat later. Somewhere below me, a hatch slammed shut. Somewhere farther out, someone screamed only once. And all I could think was this. Why had every rule they'd given me been built to make that thing notice us? That was 3 weeks before I left the platform. I took the final transfer because saying no would have meant answering questions I didn't want to answer, and because by then the company had got very good at making their requests sound like opportunities. The official version was simple enough. Temporary reassignment. Final month offshore. Senior technician coverage at a facility off the Moray Firth coast. Then a mainland post, less travel, better hours, more predictable work. They said it like they were doing me a favor. They said it like the last coastal incident I'd reported at another site had nothing to do with why they suddenly wanted me somewhere remote, somewhere inconvenient, somewhere I couldn't easily walk away from without making it look dramatic. I'd been with the company long enough to know when a decision had already been made for me. I'd also been with them long enough to understand that refusing a transfer never erased interest. It just sharpened it. So I packed my gear, got on the crew boat before dawn, and let the North Sea spray soak the knees of my coveralls on the way out. The platform came up out of the morning fog in sections. First the lights, then the dark legs of the structure rising from the water. Then the towers themselves, pale and enormous, standing still against a washed-out sky like something unfinished. It should have looked familiar. I'd spent enough of my life around turbines that their scale didn't impress me anymore. Steel was steel. Bearings failed. Gearboxes overheated. Control systems lied. I knew what I was good at, and I was good enough at it that most places only called me when a problem had already defeated everyone else. That's why I noticed the vibration before I stepped fully onto the landing deck. It came up through the gangway and into my shins, faint but regular. A low-frequency hum, almost below hearing, more felt than heard. I stopped with one boot still on the last rung and looked up at the nearest tower. The air was calm. The blades were idle. There was no reason for that structure to be carrying load. One of the deckhands took my bag and kept moving without a word. Nobody else reacted. That told me more than any instrument would have. The first person to meet me properly was Alistair Boyd Rennie. He was older than I'd expected. Not frail, but weathered into something lean and hard to read. The sort of man who'd spent so many years in salt air that even indoors he seemed to carry the coast around with him. His beard was trimmed close. His eyes were pale and permanently tired. He shook my hand once, looked at me for half a second too long, then glanced down at the transfer order clipped to my duffel. "So you're Ewan Fraser McLeod?" "I am." He nodded like that confirmed something unpleasant. "I thought it'd be you." That was my first sign I should have turned around. Instead I followed him into the operations block, where everything smelled of wet steel, old coffee, machine oil, and that same faint electrical tang I hadn't been able to place yet. He gave me the usual safety tour in a voice so flat it barely counted as speech. Muster stations, communications lockers, access lifts, manual overrides, emergency rations, weather protocols. Nothing I hadn't heard before, until he handed me the site handbook and tapped the cover with one blunt finger. "Read that," he said. "Then ignore most of it." I looked up at him. "That's meant to reassure me, is it?" "It isn't meant to do anything of the sort." There wasn't any humor in him when he said it. That bothered me more than if he'd tried to make a joke. I sat at the mess table with the handbook while the platform shifted under a long Atlantic swell. The pages were laminated against damp, corners softened from years of use. Most of it was routine: fire suppression, lockout procedures, marine evacuation. Then I hit the section on low-visibility incidents. Remain inside turbine structures when emergency beacons activate. Report unidentified aerial activity immediately. Never disable warning sirens. Use floodlights whenever visibility falls below 50 meters. I read them twice. They were written in the same corporate language every offshore manual used, all blunt verbs and false certainty. Nothing about them looked strange on paper. If anything, they looked overcautious. Alistair Boyd Rennie was standing by the galley sink when I finished. "Well?" he asked. "It reads like it was written by lawyers." It was. "And you want me to ignore it? I want you to stay alive." The way he said it made the room feel smaller. He came over, took the handbook from me, closed it, and spoke quietly enough that I had to lean in over the rattle of cutlery in the cupboard. "When the beacons come on, you leave turbine structures if you can do it safely. You never report what you see in the fog. If the sirens start, you turn them off as quick as you can reach the panel. You keep the floodlights dark after midnight. If the turbines begin spinning against the wind, stay where you are. If they stop completely, run." I stared at him for a second. "That's the opposite of half the handbook." Why?" He looked past me, through the mess room window, toward the towers standing over the water. "Because the handbook was written for people who wanted data. I'm giving you the version for people who wanted to go home." That detail seemed minor at the time. I have thought about it every day since. I asked him if this was a superstition thing. Offshore sites bred that sort of nonsense. Men trapped too long in weather and machinery would attach meaning to anything. A light that flickered at the same time every week. A stairwell that stayed colder than the others. A spot on the deck nobody sat in after dark. I'd heard worse than inverse safety rules from perfectly sober engineers. Alistair Boyd Rennie didn't argue with me. He just took my bag again and led me to my berth. At the door he stopped and said, "This is my last winter on the site. You and Fraser McLeod. It was meant to be quiet. Then they sent you." I should have asked what he meant. I should have pressed him until he either told me the truth or admitted he didn't have one. Instead I said, "I've done coastal work before." He gave me the saddest look I've ever had from another technician. "I know you have," he said. "That's why you're here." My room was barely wider than the bunk. It smelled of detergent over rust, the mattress damp at the edges from sea air that never really left the building no matter how hard the ventilation worked. I lay there that first night listening to the platform breathe, the constant throb of generators, the far metallic groan of towers flexing under loads, and beneath all of it, fainter than sound, that steady vibration moving through the structure in weather calm enough to flatten the sea. I told myself it was resonance. I told myself there was always an explanation if you were patient enough to strip away the fear people built around things they didn't understand. I had believed that before. I still wanted to believe it then. The dead calm settled over us on the fourth day, and once it arrived the platform seemed to forget how ordinary weather worked. The sea didn't go smooth. That would have made sense. It turned sluggish instead. Long oily swells rolling under a sky the color of tin while the air above the deck sat almost motionless. Even the gulls stopped hanging in the updrafts around the towers. They perched where they could or drifted far off toward the cliffs, refusing to come near the blades. By midday my neck and wrists were damp with sweat inside insulated gear, even though the temperature reading had dropped. The fog wasn't thick yet, but it moved in torn bands across the water, and every time one passed over the platform it felt warm. Not warmer than the room, warmer than the air itself, like walking through breath. I was halfway up the access ladder in Turbine 3 when I felt the low vibration change. Not stronger, more ordered, like random tremor settling into rhythm. At the nacelle hatch I paused, pressed one gloved palm against the inner casing, and felt a slow rotational load moving through the housing. There was no wind. I checked the panel. Near zero input across the platform. Nothing worth feathering blades for, never mind generating output. But the yaw system was active, and the rotor on Turbine 3 had begun to move in patient increments. Not wind-driven, command-driven. By the time I got back down to the central access platform, 2 more towers were doing the same. Nobody commented. That was what got to me. Not fear. Not confusion. Habit. Men who worked the place every day walked around it as if wrong-way blade movement in dead air was as normal as a faulty kettle. One of them passed me on the stair, smelled strongly of grease and stale soap, and kept his eyes on the treads when I asked if control had forced a test cycle. He said, "If Alistair Boyd Rennie hasn't called one, I didn't see one." Then he kept going. I spent that afternoon tracing control inputs and getting nowhere. Logs showed adjustments made from the supervisory console, but not by any user account assigned to the active shift. There were gaps too. Not missing files. Missing time. Blocks of 3 hours, sometimes 4, where readings continued but no human action was recorded. No maintenance tickets. No spoken notes. No camera flags. Just a clean seam in the site history, like someone had cut sections out with surgical care and left the rest untouched. I thought at first it was deliberate editing. Then I asked the crew about a gap from the previous week and got the same answer from 3 different men, in 3 different words. They couldn't remember. Not that they refused. Not that they didn't want to talk. They genuinely had nothing. One said he thought he'd been servicing a hydraulic brake. Another said maybe he'd slept through his off shift. Another laughed, then went quiet, then asked me if I was sure the timestamp was right. That night, the maintenance radio in the workshop crackled on by itself while I was checking a pitch motor housing. The sound made me jump hard enough to crack my shoulder on a cabinet door. At first I assumed we'd picked up a marine channel. Instead, a calm woman's voice read out a coastal forecast for the Moray Firth from October 17, 1986. Wind direction, barometric pressure, visibility warnings, sea state, all precise, all decades old. The broadcast ran for maybe 20 seconds before dissolving into static that smelled faintly metallic, if a smell can be part of a sound. I know how that sounds now, but that's the only honest way to say it. The air around the radio took on that same sharp ozone edge, and the workshop lights dimmed a fraction with each burst. Alistair Boyd Rennie was in the doorway before the forecast ended. He crossed the room in 3 steps, switched the radio off at the wall, then looked at me with a kind of tired irritation. "Did it give a date?" I told him. He nodded once. I what? It does that." I laughed then, because I still thought there was a sane explanation being withheld for some miserable site-specific reason. Old equipment picking up archive traffic isn't exactly standard. It's not archive traffic. Then what is it? He didn't answer. He opened the workshop door and sniffed the air beyond it like a man checking for rain. "Get some sleep when you can," he said. "And if the birds leave in a hurry tomorrow, don't stand about admiring it." That was the first time anyone mentioned the birds. The next morning I watched from the west rail while the sea breathed under a lid of low cloud. The air tasted of salt before the spray reached us, metallic and clean in the way it only gets before weather turns. All at once, every seabird on the platform lifted. Not startled, coordinated. Gulls, kittiwakes, a pair of skuas I hadn't even realized were there. They didn't scatter. They left, hard and direct, inland side first, as if some signal had passed through them and made staying impossible. I checked my watch. 20 minutes later, the first emergency beacon lit on Turbine 5. I didn't understand what I was looking at yet, but I understood enough to stop calling it coincidence. The fog came in that evening so thick it seemed poured. One minute I could see 3 towers out from the operations block. The next I could barely make out the handrail at the edge of the platform. wet with condensed mist that felt warm against my knuckles. The whole sight disappeared in layers. First distance, then shape, then depth itself. Sound changed with it. The usual offshore noise, the slap of water on support braces, the mechanical knock of working equipment, the low mutter of generators, all got muffled and pushed inward until every step and breath seemed too loud. Then the beacons came on. Red pulses began at the far end of the array and leapt tower to tower until the whole wind farm was blinking through the fog like a warning no one on shore would ever see. A second later, the sirens started. The official handbook was clear. Shelter inside turbine structures. Secure doors. Wait for further instruction. Every man on the platform moved at once. I'd taken 3 steps toward the nearest tower before Alistair Boyd Rennie caught the back of my coveralls and yanked me hard enough to choke me on my own collar. "Not inside," he said. "The handbook says." "I know what it says. Outside. Now." He dragged me toward an exterior maintenance deck bolted to the side of the central service module. A miserable bit of grated platform half exposed to the sea. The warm fog beaded on the rails. The sirens were already too loud, higher and sharper than any emergency tone needed to be. "Turn them off," Alistair Boyd Rennie said. I thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "The sirens. Panels there." He shoved me toward a weatherproof control box mounted beside the hatch. My fingers slipped on the wet latch. Behind me, boots hammered on stairs and then stopped as hatches sealed. Men were doing exactly what the handbook told them to do. Hiding in the towers. Floodlights flared on through the fog one after another. White cones diffused into glowing pillars. Alistair Boyd Rennie, if this is some sort of, turn them off. There was something in his voice that cut straight through argument. Not panic. Not anger. Experience. I killed the siren first. The sound died so abruptly my ears rang in the silence it left behind. Then I reached for the floodlight controls out of reflex, but Alistair Boyd Rennie slapped my hand away. "Leave those dark," he said. "They're already on across half the site." He said quietly, "and that's bad enough." The first impact hit turbine 2. I felt it through the deck before I heard it. A deep concussive jolt that ran up the steel into my knees and jaw. Then came the sound. Not a bang, not metal fatigue, but something like a massive palm striking the tower wall and dragging down it for a split second. The entire structure shuddered. Another hit followed from farther out. Then a third. No screech, no wing beat, no animal cry, just weight, speed, and the ugly, intimate sound of contact. I crouched by the rail and stared into the red-lit fog until my eyes watered. Something moved between the towers, but the fog never opened enough for shape. It only thickened where the thing passed, swirling around an absence I couldn't measure. A voice came over the internal channel, broken by static. Someone inside Turbine 5. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone. Confused, then frightened, then cut off mid-sentence. "Can they get out?" I asked. Alistair Boyd Rennie didn't answer. He was looking up. I followed his gaze just as a shadow crossed the red beacon above us. Not a silhouette. More like the fog itself taking a curved edge around something vast. The air pressure shifted. My ears popped. The warm mist rolled over the deck in a thick breath carrying salt and ozone so strong it tasted like blood from a bitten lip. The hatch to Turbine 3 burst open below us and banged against its stop. Nobody came out. I remember that more clearly than the impacts. A door flung wide from inside. Lights on in the stairwell. Steam like fog drifting into it. And no one crossing the threshold. Just empty metal steps descending into a tower that had held 2 technicians less than a minute earlier. Another tower answered with its own open hatch. And another. When the sirens died across the site, the fog thinned by degrees, as if whatever had been moving through it no longer needed cover once the noise stopped. The beacons continued their red pulse, slower now, indifferent. We waited until the cold finally returned to the air. Only then did Alistair Boyd Rennie stand and tell me to come inside. The turbine interiors were empty, not bloodied, not wrecked, not even obviously disturbed. A drop torch in one stairwell, a hard hat on a landing, A mug of tea gone cold in a control alcove. Men simply gone from closed structures with no path out except the hatches we'd watched remain shut. Officially, it was logged as a communications failure during a visibility event. That was the moment the job ended for me, even though I stayed weeks after. Not because I thought of leaving, because something inside my idea of work broke cleanly in two. I'd spent my life believing institutions failed through neglect, arrogance, cost-cutting, stupidity. All the normal, ugly reasons. I could work with those. I understood those. What I saw that night was different. The official rules had not failed us. They had done exactly what they were built to do. The next day, I started digging like a man trying to prove himself wrong. Offshore platforms keep records of everything. That's the story, anyway. Every maintenance action, every sensor drift, every override, every shift change, every weather anomaly, all captured, because if you don't write something down at sea, eventually it kills someone. I trusted records more than people. Records couldn't get embarrassed. Records couldn't decide silence was easier. So I started with the missing men, and then I went backward. The site archive room sat behind the control suite in a narrow space that smelled of paper dust, hot circuitry, and damp insulation. Most records were digitized, but there were older binders too, construction documents and early commissioning logs from when the company still trusted hard copies more than servers. Alistair Boyd, Rennie never told me not to look. That was almost permission. The disappearances went back to construction. Not every year. Not even at predictable intervals. But often enough that the language around them had become polished. Adverse visibility. Probable marine loss. Unverified man overboard. Cognitive lapse during low-pressure event. There were forms for all of it. Internal memos. Redacted incident reviews. Insurance correspondence. Enough paperwork to make absence feel administrative. Then I found the acoustic studies. They weren't where they should have been. I had to cross-reference vibration reports against maintenance expenditure to even realize something was missing. There'd been a run of expensive modifications made years earlier to blade pitch algorithms, nacelle dampening systems, and output smoothing routines across selected turbines. Not all of them. Only certain towers in certain positions along the outer arc of the farm. No public explanation. No engineering note suitable for regulators. Just authorizations and invoice codes. I pulled the waveform data attached to the modification proposals and felt the skin on my arms tighten despite the heat in the archive room. Whenever output frequencies drifted into a narrow low band during specific barometric conditions, encounter reports spiked. Not official encounter reports because nobody wrote that word. They called them environmental anomalies, workforce disruptions, visibility casualties. But laid side by side, the pattern was plain enough. The turbines weren't just making power. They were making noise something offshore cared about. At the time, I assumed it was equipment failure. I know what it actually was now. I went farther back. Early site planning, bathymetric surveys, seabird migration maps, coastal erosion records. Then tucked into a restricted appendix misfiled under environmental compliance, I found hand-drawn annotations on a regional chart. Not company standard. Pencil, faded and repeatedly copied. Arcs running between sea cliffs and offshore shallows. Crosses at old incident locations dating back before the wind farm existed. Notes about pressure fronts, fog banks, and what looked like feeding lanes along the coast. Feeding lanes. I said the phrase out loud to an empty room and heard how absurd it sounded. Then the maintenance radio on the shelf behind me clicked alive again. This time it gave a weather bulletin from May 3rd, 1994. Calm voice. Same format. Same impossible date. But before it faded into static, I heard something else under it. Not speech. A long resonant tremor. Almost too low to register. Like a call picked up through miles of metal. I switched the radio off and the archive room fell silent except for the blood in my ears. Later that afternoon I stood on the south rail with a mug of coffee gone undrinkably cold in my hand and watched the birds. I needed Alistair Boyd, Rennie, to be wrong about that at least. Needed one thing in the last 2 days to have a simpler answer. The sky was clear enough to make it cruel. Pale light. Hard horizon. A mild chop across the water. Then, without any visible cause, Every seabird on the platform rose and left together. I checked my watch again. 20 minutes later, the nearest tower began to hum. Not loudly, just enough that I could feel it in my teeth. That was the point my questions changed. I stopped asking what had happened to the missing workers and started asking what system needed those disappearances to continue calling itself functional. When I brought the acoustic files to Alistair Boyd Rennie, he didn't look surprised. He looked tired in a way that suggested surprise had become a luxury years earlier. We were in the lower workshop, where the deck always smelled of hydraulic fluid and damp rope. The weather had cleared just enough for weak sunlight to come through the porthole in a flat gray smear. I spread the printouts on the bench between us and tapped the frequency bands that lined up with incident dates. "You knew," I said. You knew those rules in the handbook were wrong. They're not wrong for what they were written for." I stared at him. "Don't talk around it." He rubbed one hand over his face, then sat on an overturned storage crate with a grunt of old bones and older patience. "Before the farm was built," he said, "the coast had stories. Not folk tales for tourists. Working stories. The sort men tell one another because somebody drowned where the sea was flat, or because every bird on a cliff face took flight in silence and something came in behind the weather. Then the company arrived with maps and studies and people in clean boots. They thought towers would change the wind and nothing more. The workshop vibrated under us, soft and steady. They built into a corridor," he went on. "Not on paper, not in law, but in the way an animal uses ground or sea or sky. And once the turbines started producing the wrong sort of sound, it had to choose. Keep to the old route and suffer it, or move. It." He nodded. "What is it?" His eyes lifted to mine, and for a moment I got the sense he was measuring not whether I deserved the truth, but whether knowing it would make my last month worse. "Something that hunts in weather," he said. "Something older than our paperwork. It doesn't care about us in the human way. Doesn't hate us, doesn't plan, but it knows when it's being challenged, and it answers challenges." "With what?" "Taking people out of sealed towers. With correction." I nearly laughed at the word. "That's how you think of it. That's how it behaves." He leaned forward then, forearms on his knees, voice low. "I've spent decades on this site, Ewan Fraser McLeod. Long enough to know what draws it and what lets it pass. You don't make noise when the pressure drops. You don't flood the fog with light after midnight. You don't report every sighting to men ashore who'll trigger study protocols and force frequencies that wake it further. And if it marks a route through the towers, you let it keep that route." Something cold moved through me despite the heat in the room. "How many men did you let follow the handbook?" He didn't answer quickly enough. That was answer enough. I stood so fast the crate skidded under my boot. "You knew it would happen. I knew somebody above us would always choose the handbook. And you stayed." Why?" For the first time since I'd met him, something like anger came into his face. Not at me, at the shape of the question itself. "Because if this place fails," he said, "it doesn't stop at the platform." We stared at each other in the stink of oil and salt, the whole workshop thrumming around us. Then his expression emptied again. "I made an arrangement years back," he said more quietly. "Or as close as a man can make one with a thing like that. Respect the corridor. Keep certain towers dark. Keep the frequencies inside tolerances when weather turns. Don't crowd it in fog. Don't challenge it with sirens. It leaves enough of us alone to keep the line standing." I heard what he wasn't saying before I understood it. Enough of us. He looked away. That night I watched him from the upper catwalk as he crossed to Turbine 7 carrying a sealed metal container about the size of a small toolbox. No labels, no markings, just dull steel with latches on both sides. He climbed down to the base platform where tower met service frame, crouched out of sight for half a minute, then came back up empty-handed. When I asked what he'd left there, he said, "Something that helps." That isn't an answer. It's the only one you'll get. Hours later, near dusk, the air turned warm again. Salt and ozone built under the cleaner scent of approaching rain. I was on the outer deck when the shadow passed overhead, larger and lower than before. The fog around it bent in a smooth rotating sheath. It crossed directly above Turbine 7. Then it changed course. No strike, no impact, no descent. Just a clean bank inland to seaward, as if the tower no longer interested it. I looked at the base platform below and thought about the metal container Alistair Boyd Rennie had hidden there. He never explained what was inside. He never had to. Whatever the bargain cost, it wasn't symbolic. It was practical. That frightened me more than any story could have. The weather eased after that, which was almost worse. You expect fear to have some manners. You expect it to peak, declare itself, maybe even justify the damage it does. Instead, the platform slipped back into routine with insulting speed. Coffee brewed. Tools were checked out and returned. Shift rotas got updated. Someone fixed the jammed locker in the west corridor. The sea went ordinary gray again. The warm fog vanished. Even the gulls came back, picking at wind-blown scraps on the railings like they hadn't abandoned the whole site in perfect unison 2 days earlier. False safety is harder on the nerves than open danger. Open danger lets your body commit. False safety makes you spend yourself twice. I started sleeping in bursts. Never deeply. Every time the structure settled under wave load, I woke expecting impacts on steel. Every time the ventilation clicked on in the night, I thought of old weather broadcasts coming through dead radios. I did my inspections. I filed my notes. I also began noticing which cameras had blind spots and which tower doors opened onto decent running space if the blades ever stopped all at once. That was new. Then Finley Rosscalder arrived. He came in on the resupply boat with fresh kit, clean gloves, and the kind of deliberate confidence I remembered having before offshore work teaches you humility the expensive way. Not cocky, just knew enough to think rules meant what they said. He was younger than me by a fair margin, broad-shouldered, eager to make a good impression, already memorizing the site by reference to manuals rather than by smell or noise or the way different stairwells carried vibration. Management called him my replacement. That was the language they used. Not trainee. Not additional support. Replacement. I'd been on the platform less than 3 weeks. I said nothing at first. I took him through the routine checks, showed him the turbine access sequence, pointed out the useless panel latches and the one lift that liked to stall 2 floors short after heavy spray. He asked good questions. He listened. He also quoted the handbook once while we were on the south deck, and something in me went cold hearing it. Later, alone in the admin office, I checked my transfer file. The paperwork authorizing my removal from offshore assignments had been drafted months before the Beacon event that supposedly justified it. Drafted, routed, and partially approved. My reporting history was attached. So was a note from an internal risk unit I'd never heard of, describing me as suitable for transitional deployment due to prior exposure and stable performance following anomalous marine incident. Prior exposure. Transitional deployment. They'd planned to move me before I ever set foot on the platform. The report I'd filed at the previous coastal site hadn't triggered concern. It had marked me. I sat there with the stale office air and printer heat in my nose, reading that line until the words blurred. Looking back, that was the last moment I could have walked away and been fine. Not safe. Not innocent. But fine enough to pretend. Instead, I closed the file, printed the page, and folded it into my pocket. That same afternoon, I took Finley Rosscalder out to inspect a newly installed blade section on Turbine 4. Weather was clear, visibility good. Nothing in the air but the faint smell of wet salt drying off painted steel. It should have been a routine orientation job. We rode the service lift up, transferred through the nacelle, and stepped into the blade access cavity where the fiberglass shell amplified every knock and breath. Finley Rosscalder shone his torch along the inner surface and said, "That part of the laminate looks odd." It wasn't the laminate. I climbed farther out and put my hand against the shell. Even through gloves, I could feel the grooves. 4 of them, deep and clean, scoring across the blade's outer skin in arcs too wide for any maintenance tool and too high above the sea to be written off as impact debris. The blade had been installed only days earlier. I crawled to the inspection port, looked out through the narrow reinforced pane, and saw the marks continuing across the white exterior in long pale scrapes, hundreds of feet above the water. Nothing should have been able to touch that. Not a bird. Not a drone. Not loose cargo. Not anything the company would have admitted existed. Behind me, Finley Ross Calder asked what had made them. I heard myself answer in the same flat tone Alistair Boyd Rennie used when he was trying not to frighten someone too soon. Something that's still learning the layout. The storm front came in from the Atlantic with a patience that made it feel inevitable long before the first rain touched us. Pressure dropped through the morning. The sky lowered by degrees. Tools felt heavier in the hand. Voices carried strangely along the deck, as if the air itself had thickened. And once again the birds left. This time I told Finley Ross Calder to watch the clock. 20 minutes, almost to the second, before the first warm band of fog moved over the outer towers. We were on a maintenance run near the eastern arc, checking a dampening assembly that had started to drift out of tolerance. The sea below was slate black, chopped by wind that hadn't yet fully arrived at platform height. I could taste metal at the back of my tongue. The nearest turbine carried a vibration so deep it seemed to come through bone instead of air. Then the cloud ceiling split open just enough to show me what had been moving inside it all along. It wasn't a bird. That sounds obvious now, but the mind reaches for the nearest category first. Wing shape, coastal setting, a thing in the sky, bird. That's how people survive ordinary surprises. By filing them fast. There was nothing ordinary to file. The body was long, too long, narrow through the middle like something built for speed in dense fluid rather than open air. Not feathered. Not skinned the way mammals are skinned. Its surface looked ribbed and tensioned, as if layers of dark membrane had been stretched over a frame that flexed independently at different points. The broad structures I'd thought were wings didn't flap. They adjusted, angled, caught pressure. Their trailing edges were almost translucent against the storm light, webbed with branching supports that glimmered wetly when lightning moved inside the clouds behind them. It flew without hurry because it didn't need hurry. Storm lift carried it. Pressure carried it. The weather itself seemed arranged around its movement. Most wrong of all was the tail, if that's what it was. Not a single tail, but several long filament structures streaming behind the body. Not limp, not decorative, but actively sensing, tasting the air, curling and uncurling as it passed the turbine field. Every time one of those filaments crossed near a blade tip, the tower beneath us answered with a change in pitch, as though the structure had been plucked. Finley Ross Calder made a sound beside me I still can't place. Not quite fear. More like the human body refusing the evidence of its own eyes. The thing banked. As it turned, I saw the underside for one clear second. There were no visible eyes where eyes should have been. Instead, there were pale recessed structures along the forward length of the head, clustered in asymmetrical lines, like pressure organs or sensory pits built to read gradients we don't notice. Below them, slitted openings pulsed wider and narrower in time with the low-frequency hum coming from the turbines. It wasn't seeing us the way we saw it. It was reading the farm. All those years, all those modifications, all those rules. We hadn't built a set of towers in its territory. We'd inserted ourselves into a communication system we didn't understand, then spent decades accidentally teaching it what our machines meant. A gust hit us hard enough to slam my shoulder into the rail. Rain came with it, cold at last, cutting through the warm fog in diagonal sheets. The creature rose with the front edge of the storm, almost vanishing until a flash inside the cloud outlined the ribbed span of it again. Then it crossed the outer arc where the modified turbines stood, and every tower in that row adjusted pitch in sequence. Not randomly. In answer. I don't know whether the original design caused that or whether the company learned to imitate something it already did. The result was the same. A corridor opened through the storm. The creature followed it for several hundred yards, then wheeled sharply when one lagging turbine failed to match frequency and dove low enough that I heard the air tear around its body. Not a screech. Not a roar. A pressure crack, deep and wet with weather, like the sky itself splitting along a seam. We got inside by luck more than judgment. In the shelter of the lower service block, with rain hammering the roof and the whole platform shaking under sudden gusts, I understood something Alistair Boyd Rennie had been trying and failing to tell me in plain words. This wasn't random predation. It was territorial enforcement against a species stupid enough to build resonance towers across an inherited hunting ground, then clever enough to half-correct the mistake. Half-corrections are what get people killed. By the time I reached the restricted archive server that night, I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was looking for the full shape of the lie. The control suite was nearly empty. Storm procedures had shifted most of the crew to essential stations, and the weather outside was loud enough to cover the hum of server racks and the dry clicking of keys. The room smelled of overheated electronics and damp wool steaming off my sleeves. I used credentials lifted from a printed routing sheet and found a directory nested behind environmental compliance, grid stability, and marine risk. Containment planning. Not public. Not regulatory. Internal. The first file was a regional chart overlaid with the wind farm layout, then older coastline maps beneath it, then incident locations older still. Once I saw them aligned, I felt physically sick. The turbines had not been placed where wind efficiency alone demanded. The arc of the farm traced historical encounter points along the sea approaches and cliff lines. Outer towers marked pressure corridors. Inner towers formed acoustic barriers. Certain gaps were left deliberately open, not for shipping access, but to preserve a route. A route inland did not exist on the early maps. That had been the whole point. The second file broke the remaining trust in me cleanly apart. It was a review memorandum written after a cluster of disappearances more than a decade earlier. The language was bloodless enough to qualify as obscene. Worker shelter compliance during beacon activations produced higher quality encounter data. Enclosed lit structures increased proximity events. Siren use sharpened target acquisition. Flood illumination improved visual tracking from remote sensors. Casualty risk elevated, but inland displacement probability decreased by measurable margins. They knew. They knew the handbook drew the creature in. They knew shelter procedures turned towers into baited markers. They knew workers who followed official guidance were more likely to vanish. And they kept the rules because every encounter taught them more about holding the line offshore. Human safety was not the primary objective. Containment was. I read file after file while the storm pressed salt against the windows hard enough to leave chalky streaks. Construction minutes describing undocumented pitch modifications. Budget approvals routed through shell departments. Incident maps reaching farther north and south than this one site had any business caring about. References to analogous offshore management zones. Cross-comparative data sets. Other coasts. Other installations. Other places where weather, infrastructure, and unexplained workforce loss had been made to fit a model. Loop 2 never closed for me after that. It only widened. How many men had disappeared because someone at a desk decided a lit tower full of technicians was an acceptable trade for cleaner telemetry? How many platforms around the world were doing versions of this under different names? How many handbooks carried rules that made perfect sense until you asked who they were really designed to protect? Then I opened my personnel file addendum. Retained after prior anomalous exposure. Demonstrates functional compliance under environmental stress. Candidate for transfer into managed coastal site during supervisor transition. Supervisor transition. That was Alistair Boyd Rennie. They hadn't sent me there despite what I'd seen before. They'd sent me because of it. A survivor who didn't break, didn't quit loudly, didn't force investigations that couldn't be contained. A man competent enough to adapt and compromised enough to be useful. I sat back from the screen and listened to the storm and understood the final shape of the betrayal. All those years working for them, and I had thought I served a difficult industry with dangerous equipment. In truth, I had been serving an institution that built itself around selective sacrifice, then called it risk management. Every checklist I had trusted. Every incident review I had signed. Every assurance that procedures existed to protect the people doing the work. All of it had been arranged around a larger promise I had never agreed to make. Keep it offshore. That was the real rule. Everything else was technique. The maximum horror of it wasn't the creature. It wasn't even what happened to the missing men. It was the scale of calm required to turn both into policy. By then I knew what the wind farm was. Not a power project with an unfortunate anomaly. Not a workplace haunted by bad luck and superstition. It was a territorial management system disguised as infrastructure, built to speak in frequencies an ancient aerial predator would understand, and adjusted over decades through the observed loss of human beings. The old stories along the Moray Firth had been right in the only way that mattered. Something lived in the weather off that coast. Something had been there long before towers, and the company hadn't discovered it so much as blundered into its language. The official rules were never meant to save us. They were meant to provoke it in controlled conditions. When the alarm tone started up on the control board, low and insistent beneath the roar of the storm, I barely reacted. By then there was almost relief in having the lie stripped down to moving parts. One of the outer containment turbines had fallen out of frequency. And inland, for the first time in the record, the predictive path line on the monitor bent toward the coast. The last shift started in earnest an hour before dawn, though by then dawn meant nothing but a slight thinning of blackness behind the storm. Rain moved sideways across the platform. The sea below had lost all surface detail and become a single convulsing dark mass around the support legs. Every structure shook, not constantly, but in hard intermittent pulses as gusts hit, released, and hit again. The air was so full of salt I could feel it drying on my lips between breaths. Ozone sat underneath it, stronger than ever. 3 turbines on the northern arc had failed to hold modulation. One had locked its blades. Another was overspeeding in stuttering bursts. The containment corridor on the board kept flickering open and closed like a wound, trying to decide whether to stay shut. If those towers stayed down, the route that kept the creature offshore would break. Alistair Boyd Rennie met me in the equipment bay, already suited up. Harness on, helmet clipped, face gray with exhaustion and something close to resignation. "You know now," he said over the wind, hammering the walls. "Aye." He nodded once, accepting both the knowledge and what it did to the next few minutes. "We restart 7 and 9 manually. If the line stabilizes, inland stays clear. If it doesn't, it follows the pressure front." "And how far inland before it stops?" His mouth twitched like he almost smiled at the uselessness of the question. "No record says." Finley Ross Calder was there too, pale and silent, eyes moving between us. He'd seen enough of the storm behavior by then to understand that normal explanations were over. I told him to stay in the operations block, keep the floodlights dark, ignore the handbook, and if the turbines stopped completely to run for the lower service trench and not look up. He opened his mouth to argue. Then something vast moved across the roof. Not a collision, passing weight. The whole bay dipped into shadow and the metal above us gave a low strained complaint as pressure rolled over it. Finley Ross Calder shut his mouth. Alistair Boyd Rennie handed me a tool case. With me, we went out into weather that felt inhabited. That is the only phrase I found for it. Not bad weather. Not severe weather. Weather with intent moving through it. Gusts arrived before the visible fronts that should have carried them. Warm fog coiled low around the tower bases while freezing rain slashed the upper decks. The turbines moaned in different voices as frequency loads drifted out and back. More than once I felt the odd pressure pop in my ears that meant the thing was close, even when cloud and spray hid the sky entirely. We reached Turbine 7 by clipping on and hauling ourselves hand over hand across slick catwalk sections while the structure vibrated underfoot like a tuning fork the size of a building. Inside the base chamber the smell was hot metal, wet concrete, and that sharp lightning smell of stressed electrical systems. Manual restart on a tower under those conditions was ugly work. Override the brake lock. Reset pitch control locally. Force the dampening cycle. Pray the generator synchronized before the next grid shutter threw it out again. My hands stayed steady because they'd had to stay steady for most of my life. That's what competence is in the end. Not confidence. Repetition under pressure until fear learns to wait its turn. Above us, through layers of steel, something struck the outer casing and slid. The whole chamber rang. Neither of us spoke. We both knew speech would have been wasted oxygen. We got 7 back into band for 30 seconds, lost it, got it back, and held long enough for the corridor display in my headset to show partial recovery. Then we moved to 9. On the transit deck between towers, with the storm all around us and the fog breathing warm against cold rain, I saw the creature lower than I ever had before. It crossed between two towers at an angle that should have been impossible for its size. The membranes along its span flexed and cupped the wind, not fighting turbulence but shaping it. The forward sensory pits along its head pulsed pale in the beacon wash. One of the trailing filaments touched a blade tip and the entire rotor changed pitch a fraction, answering like a struck string. Then it passed directly over us. From beneath, I saw one more detail I hadn't before. Along the underside of the body, where a bird would have smooth contour or a fish-like creature might have clean ventral lines, there were layered slits opening and closing in sequence, dozens of them, each modulating as if sampling resonance from the towers below. Not lungs, not gills. Instrumentation written in flesh. It wasn't just reacting to the farm. It was reading whether the farm still respected the boundary. Alistair Boyd Rennie froze beside the rail. I followed his stare and saw, half shielded by the tower base, another of those sealed metal containers already waiting where he must have placed it earlier. Storm water ran over the lid. He unclipped himself without a word. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "Buying you time." He picked up the container. That was when I understood the shape of his bargain, though not its full contents. He had not survived decades on the platform by being wiser than the company or braver than the missing men. He had survived by learning what could be offered, when it had to be offered, and how much silence that knowledge required. Maybe the container held biological waste. Maybe acoustic lures. Maybe records, tags, something steeped in human trace. I still don't know. The fact that I don't know bothers me less than the fact that he always did. He moved into the warm fog with the container held low in both hands like something ceremonial only because care and repetition can resemble ritual from a distance. I went after him. He turned once, rain running down his face, and shouted over the storm. "Get 9 online, you and Fraser McLeod. That's the job." Then the pressure hit. Not impact, presence. The air compressed around us so fast my chest seized. Fog folded inward. The nearest beacon strobed red across a curve of ribbed membrane descending through cloud. I lost sight of Alistair Boyd Rennie for 1 second. Then he was gone. No cry, no fall, no body over the rail. Just the metal container spinning once across the deck and coming to rest against a drain lip. One latch bent open, whatever had been inside already taken or thrown clear into whether I couldn't search. I stood there like an idiot for 2 heartbeats, staring at empty fog. Then Turbine 9 stopped completely. Run, he'd told me, if they stop completely. Instead I ran toward the tower. I don't know whether that was courage, training, anger, or the last reflex of a man too deep in a mechanism to imagine stepping out of it. Probably all 4. I got inside 9, hit the manual sequence with fingers that finally started to shake, and forced the dampening routine through while the structure screamed around me under load. Twice the restart faulted. The 3rd time the generator caught. The change moved through the tower like a breath returning to a chest. Out on the platform the rest of the arc answered. 7 held. 8 stabilized. 10 came back into phase half a beat late but close enough. On the monitor in my headset the corridor line smoothed, bent seaward again and stayed there. Overhead, the pressure eased. Not vanished. Never vanished. But eased enough to tell me the thing had turned away from the coast. When I made it back to the operations block, soaked through and tasting copper from where I'd bitten the inside of my cheek, Finley Rosscalder pulled me in and barred the door behind me. The control suite lights were dim. The beacons outside still pulsed, slower now. On the main display, the inland projection had retracted to offshore markers. Temporary stabilization. That was the phrase on the screen. Temporary. We never found Alistair Boyd Rennie. Officially, he was lost during emergency maintenance in severe weather. The company accepted that faster than they had accepted any mechanical report I'd ever filed. No search beyond protocol. No questions that mattered. No interest in the bent latch on the empty metal container I slid into a locker and never mentioned. His workstation was cleared within 2 days. His access removed within 3. On paper, he became the sort of absence large organizations produce with frightening efficiency. I stayed for the remaining weeks because someone had to know which rules to break. That was the worst part. Not that they wanted a replacement. that by then I understood why the replacement had to be me, at least for a little while. I knew the unofficial procedures. I knew the timing of the birds. I knew the smell before activity, the warmth of the fog, the way turbine frequency could calm or provoke, the fact that silence sometimes protected better than alarms, and the harder fact that institutions would keep feeding people into the line as long as the line held. So I trained Finley Rosscalder. Not all at once. Not with speeches. The way Alistair Boyd Rennie had trained me, except I was kinder, and I hope that mattered. I showed him which towers carried the wrong vibration in still weather. I told him never to trust a handbook that treated enclosure like safety without asking what the enclosure signaled. I made him watch the birds. I made him listen to the pitch of the blades in calm air. I made him understand that professionalism offshore wasn't obedience. It was pattern recognition sharpened until it felt like superstition to people who hadn't lived long enough to earn it. On my final morning, the sea was almost gentle. That's what made the leaving feel obscene. The helicopter arrived under a high gray sky with only a smear of weather building far beyond the horizon. Salt spray dried white on the railings. The platform smelled of fuel and wet rope and coffee from the galley vent. Ordinary things. Human things. The kind you miss once a place has shown you what else shares it. Before I went to the pad, I left a handwritten notebook in Finley Rosscalder's berth. Not a confession. Not a report. Reports disappear into systems built to digest them. This was a field notebook. Page 1 had the real rules in plain language. Leave turbine structures when emergency beacons activate. Never report what you see in the fog over open channels. Turn the sirens off. Keep floodlights dark after midnight. If the turbines begin spinning against the wind, stay where you are. If they stop completely, run. After that, I wrote everything else I could fit. The birds, the dates on the radio, the warm fog, the frequency bands, the signs of a corridor shifting, the things I knew, the things I suspected, the things I still could not explain. I did not write what I thought was in Alistair Boyd Rennie's container. Some knowledge is less useful once it has a shape. As the helicopter lifted, the platform dropped away in slow mechanical grace. Towers turned below me, white against the dark water, beautiful in the same sterile way scalpels are beautiful. For a second the whole farm looked exactly like what the brochure said it was. Clean energy, engineering, progress at sea. Then I looked down through the side window and saw Finley Rosscalder standing on the edge of the pad access deck with my notebook open in both hands. He was reading the first page. Beyond him, far out over the water, storm clouds had begun to gather in a long dark wall. I never learned how many other installations use different names for the same work. I never learned whether the missing men from this coast were counted anywhere that mattered, or whether other shorelines have their own Alistair Boyd Rennies carrying metal containers through warm fog before dawn. The archive files suggested enough to keep me awake and withheld enough to keep the rest of my life uncertain. What changed in me wasn't dramatic. Now, wherever I am, if the air suddenly smells like salt and ozone where there shouldn't be any sea, I stop what I'm doing and check whether the birds have gone quiet first.